Now, if you've never worked with HTML or CSS before, I want to take a minute in this movie and talk about how the two are related and how the browser sees these. So here on my screen, I have an HTML file on the left, I have a CSS file in the center, and I have a preview of a web browser over on the right-hand side. And so what happens is the HTML file that we see over on the left-hand side has a link or a reference to the CSS file. So this link right here that says relative style sheet type equals CSS, we're referencing an individual file called the style sheet. The center column shows all of the CSS rules that are associated. In this case, these are blank. And on the right-hand side, we see how the browser interprets that. So browsers have something inside of them called a rendering engine. And what the rendering engine does is it determines how the HTML is viewed in our pages. Before we had CSS, everything on the web looked very much like what we're seeing here. We had either a white or a gray background. Everything was black times Roman. And all of the rendering engines have a very sort of similar default styling. What CSS does, which is the center document here, is allows us to redefine the way items look in the browser. So on the left-hand side in the HTML document, I can see I have two elements here. I have an H1 tag and I have a paragraph tag. Now throughout the course, we're going to be creating not only links to CSS files, but our own sets of tags in our HTML file. Now to quickly demonstrate this, I'm going to come over to the CSS file, and what we do in the CSS file is we target the names of the HTML elements that we see over on the left-hand side. So to target or restyle an H1 tag, in the CSS, I would simply type H1, then a space, then a beginning and ending bracket, and inside of the brackets, we're going to target certain properties. So for example, let's say I come in here to font size, I set this to 75 pixels, I can see immediately on the right-hand side that heading 1 is now being rendered at 75 pixels. I'm going to come in here and add a color attribute. Let's come in and maybe pick a red color. Put a semicolon after each one of the different properties, and we can see that now the styling of the heading is now 75 pixels tall with a color of red. Let me add a few more lines here. Let's add a paragraph tag. Let's set a color here to, I'll just pick a medium gray. Now we can see the type is now showing up in this light gray. Let's add one more tag into our content. I'm going to come over here and add an anchor tag. href equals, two quotes. This is where we can link to an actual website. http://. I'll type codifydesign.com. And then we'll come out to about right here and we'll end that anchor tag. Now anchor tags are the way that we add hyperlinks into our document. And we can see the hyperlink now showing up over here. And we can also redefine the way anchor links look as well. So let me hit a few returns. I'll type in A. Type color, and let's just pick a color for the anchor links. Maybe a green. Now we can see the link showing up over here in green. Now another fundamental aspect of the way browsers see HTML is that every element inside of HTML gets what's called a bounding box. So if you've used tools like Illustrator or InDesign or Quark Express where you've imported graphics, every one of the graphics that you import has a bounding box. And even though the graphics that you're importing might not be a perfect square, the bounding box will always be a square. That's how computers actually see the bounding area of items. So HTML inside the browser works very much the same way. Now these bounding areas to all of the HTML elements is referred to as the box model. Now to get a sense of what the box model looks like, we can actually use CSS and use a border property to have the browser reveal what the box model looks like. So let's come into our CSS, and I'm going to bring this back down to about 45 pixels high for the heading 1. And then after that, what I'm going to do, I'm going to type border, 3 pixels, solid, and I'll just put in 3 zeros for black. Once I apply the border, you can see that the heading now shows me the box model for that object. So headings have a display type called block, which means it takes up the entire horizontal space of the browser. If I come over here and resize the browser, I can see that that box model will always be the full available width. Let me come in here and copy this border property. Let me come down here and apply this to the anchor tag. And notice that the border or the box model for the anchor tag is actually broken across the wrapping area. So if I come in here and open this up, I can see that the box model for the anchor tag actually breaks or wraps around multiple lines. This display type is referred to as inline. Later on, when we actually take anchor links for the mobile size and move them down on the small screen device, we're going to change an anchor link from being an inline style to a block style, like what we're seeing up above. Now, the other way we can target items in CSS is if we add our own classes to the HTML, then we can lock onto those custom names that we create in our CSS. So to see what that looks like, let's come back to the HTML file, and I'm going to come in here and add a tag called the div tag, div. This stands for division. Now, inside of the div tag, I'm going to add a class attribute, and I'll just call this sidebar. Inside here, I'm going to put another paragraph tag, and let me just copy a sentence here. I'll just paste this inside of the paragraph tag. Now, a div tag also has block properties, and a div is a way that we can actually sort of group together multiple sets of tags. The div tag, in addition to some other HTML5 elements, is going to be the core way that we define areas or regions within our HTML file. Now, in the CSS file, in order to target that class, I'm going to type dot sidebar. So the period here before this rule name tells the browser that we're looking for a class. So the class of sidebar over here is represented with the dot here in the CSS. Let's hit a space. Let's put in our brackets, and let's come in here and let's add our border to this. Now we can see our web view over here showing us the block properties around that, matching what we see inside of the heading. Let me open this up, and here I want to talk about two more basic principles for this object. When we're targeting an individual item, we can change not only the display type, but we can change the width of these objects as well. So I'm going to come in here, target that width, and we're going to set this to 200 pixels. Notice that the box now only takes 200 pixels wide. Even if I come in here and open and close the browser, that div is now going to be locked to 200 pixels wide. The next property I'm going to set is a property called margin. So I'm going to set margin left, and I'm going to set that to 40 pixels. So what margins do is they affect everything outside of the object. So putting a margin left means that this div will now move 40 pixels from its left-hand side, defined here by margin left. The next rule I'm going to create is padding left. Put 30 pixels on the left-hand side, come back to the browser, and notice that now the type inside now moves 30 pixels from the left-hand side. So again, margin affects everything on the outside of the object. Padding affects everything on the inside of the object. It's this core idea of how we're going to actually position and move things inside of the browser, especially when we go to different screen sizes, using things like margin and padding on those actual containers. Now, the last thing I'll take a look at here is this idea of setting a float. So again, I'm still in the sidebar. I'm going to say float this to the right. And what that does is that takes that entire div element, sticks it over to the right-hand side of the browser, and then lets content flow around the left-hand side of it. This is very similar to creating a text wrap in an application like Express or InDesign. And so what this does is it puts that item over on the side and allows any of the code underneath to sort of flow up. And now that we have a base understanding of how the HTML is structured, how the CSS targets individual HTML elements and classes, and how we can override the way the browser shows this, we're ready to start building our project in the next movie.